Thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome. What a great day. Thank God. What a great day. Praise God. Thank you. The Lord bless you. You can be seated tonight. Appreciate that note of confidence. Praise God. If you have your Bibles, turn in your to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. We have had a wonderful week this week. Can you say amen? Great blessing of God's favor. I'm listening to these men preach, and before today, they had reiterated and reconfirmed everything that we are and what we do. And I was sitting there saying, thank God, these people have got it. They understand what we're doing. They understand what we're about. Some of the finest preaching you'll ever hear in the world. You heard here this week. And some of these ministers, Richard Ruby, Mark Olson, if I had given them a text, they couldn't have preached any more of what I wanted to say and what we are and what we do. So we're part of what is known as the Jesus People movement. What God has done in our fellowship is directly related to what he was doing. There are a number of books that have been written. One of these is about the Jesus People movement, is God's Forever Family. You need to get that and read it. It's about the Jesus People movement. The Jesus People movement, by that title, written by an English pastor who did his homework. He examined us, read our sermons, listened to our tapes, and then wrote a book called The Jesus People Movement. He's in England, and that's worth your time to read. John Gooding talked to me sometime in a time past and said he's going to write a book and begin to reiterate what it is about our fellowship that will continue it and keep it going. And he talked to me. I talked to him a number of times. He wrote a tremendous book, and that book is called Regions Beyond. I added a little byline to that, and that was Regions Beyond, impacting the world from a small church in a small town. That describes what happened. And recently, Greg Laurie, who is a part of the Calvary Chapel Ministry, wrote a book called The Jesus Revolution. All of these use names, quote phrases about people that have been a part of the Jesus People movement, because our fellowship without the Jesus People movement would probably never have appeared. Our fellowship is not unique in itself, but because we tied on to what God was doing, we're here tonight. This building's packed, most people here than have ever been at one of our conferences, and correctly labeled. And I want to minister tonight. If you're a preacher, don't analyze this sermon. This sermon is not correctly organized. You could more properly call this sermon Miscellaneous Thoughts on a Religious Subject. Because I want to point out some of the factors that are involved that made us what we are, as we move through this in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 through 16. But we will not boast of things without our measure, but according to the measure of the rule which God has distributed to us, a measure to reach even unto you. For we stretch not ourselves beyond our measure, or as though we reach not unto you. For we're come as far as to you also in preaching the gospel of Christ, not boasting of things without our measure, that is, of other men's labors, but having hope when your faith has increased, that we shall be enlarged by you according to our rule, abundantly, to preach the gospel in regions beyond you, and not to boast in another man's line of things made ready to our hand. Regions beyond. First of all, I want to point out to you that some of the factors that made us what we are, and there are a number of those. One of those is outside the four walls. Most of you who have become a part of this fellowship don't realize how unique that is in the church world. In the early days, I organized an impact team into Phoenix, Arizona. I mentioned that recently in our congregation, then asked if there were anybody present that had been a part of that impact team. This was when we began to use impact teams. And that's not an accident. That has tremendous meaning. It has dimensions. It has something that you need to pay attention to, because we organized an impact team of 75 people involved in that into Phoenix. We went into Encanto Park with those 75 people. Most of these were fairly new converts within the last couple of years. We did an outreach into Encanto Park. We wound up at my old church, which is today Gary Marsh's church, and this is a church that I was saved in. This is a church that my family was in, and we came back into that, bringing 110 people off the streets. My niece saw this coming in. One of these came in. He had a bolt-action rifle wired to his Levi jacket, and many of them were long-haired hippies. And my niece, who saw this crowd coming in, she said, "Wayman, I sure hope you know what you're doing." Well, I didn't, actually, but it worked out fine. There was a young man saved. Eden played in that service that night with a featured performance. This was one of the early music groups that we had. And there was a young man saved in that service that night who became the youth leader of that church for a period of time. And I'm not sure all that was taking place, but I think that must have been the first sinners that had come into that church when I left, since I left. But anyhow, it worked out fine. So this was revolutionaries. Now, we're not talking about something that the church world has always done. We're talking about something that was absolutely revolutionary. Impact teams that went out evangelizing with advertising and with literature and began to function outside the church walls. Churches were not doing that generally. I know when I was a new convert, we went into the Glendale Park. I used to go in and preach in that park with a group of young people. And we went out to preach, and this was absolutely new. We street preached I remember preaching on the streets of Phoenix, down close to the Skid Row district where the bums gathered together for a free meal. It was called a mission. And our first church that we sent out was brought to a sudden end by ministering outside the four walls. We sent Harold Warner and Mona to Kearney, Arizona. There was a group of charismatics up there, and they heard what we're doing, came over, visited the service. They really liked what they saw, but didn't realize fully what it was. As Harold went out the first weekend, they were having a parade. He was accompanied by Ron Jones, and as this is a parade, it was a ready-made outreach program. So while this parade was going on, Ron Jones and Harold Warner said, this is a great opportunity to street preach. And so they began to preach right along with the parade. And as they're walking along, Harold says he looked over to the man who had asked them to come there, a jewelry store owner, a very prominent member of that society. And he looked over, and he was looking at him and Ron Jones preaching, and he was not a happy camper. He was embarrassing them before the citizens of his city. And so he came as soon as the parade was over, came to Harold and said, you folks can go back home. This is not really what we want here. And so Harold and Ron were headed back home when Harold slipped off the highway, broke his back, was crippled for life. So outside the four walls is a prominent part of our fellowship. The text that I began with and promptly forgot about is 2 Corinthians chapter 10. But we will not boast of things our measure, but according to the measure of the rule, as far as you also in preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now think about this for a moment, because when we did this is most churches that are represented here, you do things outside the four walls, but I want to tell you that was absolutely revolutionary in those days. So think about this for a moment. Harold was crippled. As soon as he got out of the hospital, I was preaching in Prescott, and this stirred me up. Some of our people in our congregation thought this is proof that this is not a move of God, because if this was so, God would have blessed this and Harold would not have gotten crippled. So this is stupid Christians that come to wrong conclusions about the gospel. Janet Foley was in that service when I preached and challenged. I challenged our congregation for people to come and replace Harold and Mona. And Janet Foley was a 15-year-old girl when she was in that service, and I've heard recently that when she saw that happening, 16 young couples responded to give their lives to God to preach the gospel that night. Most of them made their way into ministry in the process of time. And she said about that, when she saw this happen, this moved her very deeply, because it caused her to realize that common people could do a work for God. She sees these people. Harold was different. Harold, nobody was surprised when we sent him out. He was deeply dedicated. When he was going to be baptized, he wanted to be baptized naked. So they weren't surprised when he went out. But when she saw these 16 young couples come, she saw that just common people could do a work for God. I preached a sermon on that recently, and left that there. So in street preaching and preaching outside the four walls, there are not large numbers of people that are joined to the church, but something happens. And what happens is that boldness comes into the hearts of those that are out there preaching, and it takes the timidity away and does a tremendous work of commitment that is there. So a number of things we began to do. I went over to California. I heard about the Calvary Chapel movement over there, them baptizing people in the ocean. I took Ron Jones and Harold Warner over, said, let's go over and see what's happening over there. We went over, we visited Calvary Chapel there in California. We visited Don Madison's church in La Habra. We went to the beach and saw Larry Reed baptizing people and preaching on the beach. And I'm sitting in that building in La Habra, and I've never seen young people in church that living for God. They were all little demon-possessed church people. And you bring anybody in unsaved, and they'd rip them off before the service is over. So I'm looking out there, I'm observing this, they're playing, and we're sitting on the floor. There's a building that probably is not as large as this platform. We're all jammed in there, about that many outside. And I leaned over as I saw that, and I said, this will work in Prescott. Young people in church, talking about God, talking about the gospel. And so this was an educational moment for us as we were there. As soon as we got back from that, I rented a building down on Granite Street, and we opened up a coffee house. So think about this for a moment, because these are revolutionary things. When you talk about a coffee house today, say, oh yeah, that's old hat. But it was not old hat in those days. I'm actually expecting the organization to come in and shut us down. So think about this for a moment, because here's this beach baptism of Larry Reed. One of the things that happened very soon thereafter is we started a ministry reaching drug addicts, we thought, and we advertised it locally in Prescott. That made it known that this is what it is. We filled a building on Lincoln Street. When I say filled it, it had 72 seats in it. But you have to understand that this is back then, not now. This is wonderful. Look at all these people here. There's at least 3,000 in here, and probably they're estimating 3,500 before we get through. But you're talking about 72 people in a building to hear the gospel. That was big time. Now you have that all the time in your churches, various kind, but this was big time. So many things we're going to mention that we began to do. Beach baptism. When we saw Larry Reed baptizing, I talked to him. I said, would you come over to Arizona, bring these 3 girls that you're using in this outreach team, and do an outreach for us? He said, sure, I'll do that. So we'll get together in that. So we made a date and put it off somewhere in the future. When they came over, Don Madison was in La Habra, California, and he comes over with 2 hippies and acoustic guitar, no equipment of any kind. I'm expecting this amplifiers and everything to come, no equipment. We had to go out and rent the equipment from Matty at Sensabaugh. And so we did an outreach in the old junior high school where I went to junior high school. They shut it down, it's closed down. And by a miracle, we got the use of that to do a concert. And I saw 200 teenagers come into that building. I'm astonished. I think it was Mona Warner was saved in that first outreach. It seems to me that Ernie Lister was saved in that, and one of the other Rices came. And so this was absolutely revolutionary. I sent to some friends of mine in Kingman, Arizona that were pastoring. I said, you've got to come down and see this. Now, see, I'm talking about unsaved teenagers coming into a church program where the gospel is going to be enumerated, and it's not happening here in Prescott, never has happened. So I sent to my friends in Kingman, I said, you got to come down and see this. They did come down. 200 teenagers in that first outreach. I had an unsaved hippie from Yavapai College come in, had hair down to his belt. He had a big beard. He had a leather jacket on. He's not even saved. And I had him do the lead song of that. You're a brave man, Pastor, either brave or very ignorant. And we probably had 35 of those teenagers saved. In that, we started doing concerts regularly. We did several concerts in the old junior high school, did our Coffeehouse Ministry, and did that. So several things took place in very short order. One of the things happened very quickly is that three of our converts, Janet Foley, Janet Payson, Ron Burrow, and Ron Jones, went out to the Yavapai County Fair. And you know, when you got people in one place, well, that's fertile ground, right? So they went out, jumped up on a table, and started preaching, and got arrested promptly. And the next day, on the front page of the Prescott Courier, the worldwide Prescott Courier, here's their pictures on that. And I mean, we were on the map then. Because every rebellious teenager, pot-smoking teenager in town says, that's the place to go. So these are things that are revolutionary. Our building that we rented on Grant Street, we called The Door. That had never been used before. You don't call churches The Door. You call them the Calvary Chapel or the Potter's House or Foursquare or something. You don't call them The Door. What on earth is The Door all about? So as I was saying to you, this couple from Kingman, when they saw this, they saw the same thing that I saw. They're totally turned off and rejected. But what I saw was I saw the possibility, and we're off and running, and we did many, many things. But discipleship became a process. Remember, I named these books. You need to read these books. God's Forever Family, The Jesus People Movement, The Jesus Revolution by Greg Laurie, a new one, and Regions Beyond. How many of you have read Regions Beyond by John Gooding? What's the matter with you bunch of rebels anyway? I'm talking to you, there's revelation in that book. Say, well, how does this all work? That's how it works. Read the book. Oh, no, but you're just all beyond that, you know. You got your toy. You can play with that. Read the book. That book tells exactly what we are. I asked this same question wherever I preach. I was just preaching somewhere recently. I said, how many of you read the book? I think 4 out of about 250 people lifted their hand. We've read the book. So either this is not being advertised, or we've got a bunch of rebellious pastors that they don't want to do anything to anybody else. They got their own thing. Nothing's happening, but they know everything, you know. So we learned a lot of things as we get in this. There's a book that's been written that is by Robert Coleman. If I can think of the name offhand, somebody name it out for me. Master Plan of Evangelism. I read that book in 1965. I was pastoring in Emmett, Idaho. When I read that book, The Master Plan of Evangelism, I said, that's right. This is great. But I had never done it, and he had never done it either. He was just writing from the book. But I did start doing it when I came to Prescott and we started working with hippies, some fresh material. I did read it, and I said, that's fantastic. That's the gospel. So discipleship became a part of what we are and what we do, but there are certain things that are involved there. That's not just an accident. I think it was Richard Ruby as he's preaching, he's saying that this is not an accident. Certain processes we went through, and one of those was that we, Friday and Saturday night of every week, we had a concert, which we called a concert. We called it a rock concert, and these hippies are playing. None of them were good, I want to tell you that. They all thought they were good, but they weren't. But it didn't matter. That's what God was doing. And if you want to be successful, find out what God is doing. Not what somebody says he's doing, but what he's actually doing. And there must be people that are getting saved to see what God is doing. Numbers of things have been adapted. Greg Mitchell adapted in Prescott Serious Men, where he began to meet with young men on Sunday morning, teach them how to make a sermon, teach them how to interpret the scripture. To make a long story short, it's work, W-O-R-K. If it wasn't for that, everybody would have revival. I taught them very closely, very quickly, this is not church, this is an outreach. Church is over across town on Lincoln Street. This is an outreach. And if they didn't attend, then they did not perform either. How many of you know that there are rules in life? You know what rules are? R-U-L-E-S, rules. That means you have to discipline yourself to somebody that's in charge that'll tell you this is what you're going to do if you're going to play in this rodeo. Out of that comes a disciple. Concert ministry, and some of you are too smart for concert ministry because you don't have any really good musicians in your church. We didn't have any really good musicians in our church, but we shaped them and began to encourage them and begin to teach them and work with them. Several times I loaded up a van load of young converts, took them to Los Angeles because, listen carefully to me, because when they're genuinely converted, they want to be like, Jesus says, Luke 50, they want to be like their teacher. So when they began to come to church, we had suits and ties on. Did you hear what I said? We didn't dress down. And they all wanted to have suits and ties, and nobody had any. I loaded them up, took them over to Los Angeles Street, 9th and Los Angeles Street, where you could get a cheap suit for about $59. Were they good suits? No. But they were cheap. So we had probably 8 or 10 young people. We went over, and I'm talking all the time. I'm answering questions. If you want to make disciples, you have to spend time with them. All the time we're traveling, they're asking questions about what I preached, or why we do this or why we do that. And I'm making input into them. We drove to Los Angeles Street, and we'd get there, it seems to me about 9 or so in the morning, and shop through these places. They'd buy their suits. We'd drive back to Indio, then spend the night. We'd eat at a restaurant there somewhere, and then we'd all spend the night in a hotel somewhere there, and they'd spend the next couple of hours trying on these beautiful suits. But there was a method to my madness. I got to spend time with them, and I got to make input into them, and this eventually played out to plant churches. Any genuine convert to Christ wants to impart what has happened to them. If they don't want to do it, then they're not saved. As Glenn Cluck says, get back down on your knees and get saved. And so that naturally played out in them wanting to do impact teams, outreach. We began to discover that unless we planted a church there, the fruits of our labors did not retain. And so we began to do that. That's how Harold got hurt in Kearney, Arizona. The first long-term plant we made was Wrong Burl in Wickenburg, Arizona. Wickenburg, Arizona is pretty close to the center of the world. 1,500 people lived in Wickenburg, Arizona. When I pastored there, the dudes would come out of New York City and come and play cowboy over there for a while. But it's filled with people like are in Wickenburg, Arizona. They're not exactly the best examples of people on the earth. We put Ron Burl in Wickenburg, Arizona. He's a rock musician. I mean, it's in him. It's in every fiber of his being. We planted him there. In 7 months, he's self-supporting. Now think about that. I'm thinking, wow! Who was it, Richard Ruby, that talked about indigenous this morning? That's what indigenous is. It means no more support you have to send. 7 months, he is self-supporting, and we're off and running now. We're hooked. So these are little facts along the way. And remember what Janet Foley said, common people can do a work for God. That dawned on her. I preached a whole sermon on that, preached it somewhere recently. And 7 months, an indigenous process, an indigenous self-supporting work that God has touched hearts. And now we're beginning to gain some experience. We're beginning to set some standards in place, what you're going to have to do. If you play in the Palace Bar on Saturday night, you're not going to play in our church, you're not going to play in our coffee house. But he's a good musician. I don't care how good he is. If the Palace Bar's still in him, he don't belong in our coffee house. Well, Pastor, where's the love at? That is love. So we begin to develop patterns. We begin to develop standards. And music is one of the motivating dimensions of human nature. We have churches that have no music ministry. They won't spend the time to develop it or seek it out because nobody is really talented like they were when they were young. One of the best places to make disciples is a Coffeehouse Ministry. They have to commit themselves to be able to play there. They have to live a lifestyle that what they say will be believed. And so here they are. I'm not a musician. Some of my children were musicians. Greg's a tremendous musician. He plays the organ, plays the piano, plays the trumpet, plays drums. I'm not a musician. Much of the music that I heard, I hated. Rap music is a strange instrument. Anytime I go and they play rap music, when you get through, I have to ask, what did they say? But I can tolerate it if it'll get people saved. Can you say amen? So, many other things I could say. When I go and preach, sometimes the pastors take me out and take their disciples with us, and all the time we're trying to eat, they're asking non-stop questions, and some of them are very, very good. But we have to be honest. Is God built what we're sitting in tonight, not us? God did this. We just simply tied on to it, and we rode it along, and we're where we are today because God is at work in planet Earth. Amen. Let's bow our hearts for a moment as we're here.